How does someone find the courage to say no to absolute power? What kind of principle is worth more than life itself? And why did More's final stand on Tower Hill echo through history as the ultimate victory of conscience over coercion? This is the story of St. Thomas More, the lawyer who proved that some things are non-negotiable, not because they're profitable, but because they're true. If you've ever faced pressure to compromise your deepest beliefs, let this story show you what integrity looks like when it costs everything. When conscience and power collide, which would you choose? For Thomas More, the answer was set long before Tower Hill. Hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the courage, convictions, and choices that still speak to us today. On the 7th of February 1478, in the bustling commercial heart of London, a boy was born who would one day face the ultimate test of loyalty. Loyalty to king versus loyalty to God. Thomas More entered a world on the cusp of transformation, where medieval certainties were giving way to Renaissance questioning, where new ideas challenged ancient authorities, and where a man's conscience would soon be tested against royal power. Thomas More entered a world on the cusp of transformation, where medieval certainties were giving way to Renaissance questioning, where new ideas challenged ancient authorities, and where a man's conscience would soon be tested against royal power. Thomas's father, John More, was a successful barrister and judge who had built a prosperous legal practice serving London's merchant class. The More household was one where books were treasured, learning was prized, and intellectual achievement was considered the highest form of success. From his earliest years, Thomas was immersed in an atmosphere of scholarship and legal precision that would shape his entire approach to life. Even as a child, Thomas displayed the brilliant mind and quick wit that would make him famous throughout Europe. He could debate theological points with visiting priests, compose Latin poetry that impressed university scholars, and argue legal cases with a sophistication that amazed adult lawyers. But more than intellectual gifts, Thomas possessed something rarer, an unshakable moral compass that would guide him through every twist and turn of his remarkable career. At age 12, Thomas was sent to serve as a page in the household of Cardinal John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. A chance to observe the highest levels of church and state, to learn from one of England's most powerful men, and to make connections that could shape his entire future. Cardinal Morton quickly recognized Thomas's exceptional abilities and arranged for him to study at Oxford University, where he immersed himself in the new humanist learning that was sweeping through European universities. Thomas studied Greek and Latin, philosophy and theology, law and literature, becoming what his contemporaries called a complete man, someone who combined classical learning with Christian virtue. But Thomas was more than just a scholar. He possessed a warmth and humor that made him beloved by everyone who knew him. His letters were filled with jokes and wordplay, his conversations sparkled with wit, and his home became a gathering place for the most brilliant minds in England. He could discuss theology with bishops, debate philosophy with scholars, and joke with common laborers with equal ease and genuine affection. After Oxford, Thomas followed his father into the legal profession, quickly establishing himself as one of London's most successful lawyers. His combination of brilliant legal analysis, absolute honesty, and genuine concern for justice made him the attorney that everyone wanted to represent them, and the one that powerful interests feared to face in court. But success in law was only the beginning of Thomas's extraordinary career. He was about to discover that all his achievements would be tested against one simple question: what happens when human law conflicts with divine law? By 1510, Thomas More had achieved everything a Renaissance gentleman could desire. His legal practice was thriving, his scholarship was gaining international recognition, and his family life with his beloved wife Jane was filled with joy. He had built a magnificent home in Chelsea that became known throughout Europe as a center of learning and culture. Thomas's house was remarkable for its time, a place where his daughters received the same classical education as any nobleman's sons, where servants were treated with dignity and respect, where intellectual discussion flourished around the dinner table and where visitors from across Europe came to experience what they called the School of More. But it was Thomas's writing that brought him to the attention of the wider world. In 1516, he published Utopia, a work of political philosophy that imagined an ideal society based on reason, justice, and the common good. The book was an immediate sensation, translated into multiple languages and discussed in universities throughout Europe. Utopia revealed Thomas's deepest values, his concern for the poor, his commitment to justice, his belief that government should serve the common good rather than the interests of the powerful. It also demonstrated his ability to critique existing systems without attacking individuals, to promote reform without encouraging revolution. King Henry VIII, who had recently ascended to the throne, was fascinated by this brilliant lawyer who could write philosophy, speak multiple languages, and navigate the complex world of international diplomacy with equal skill. In 1518, Henry appointed Thomas to his royal council, beginning a relationship that would shape both their destinies. Initially, the partnership between king and counselor seemed perfect. Henry was young, energetic, and apparently committed to ruling with wisdom and justice. Thomas was brilliant, experienced, and genuinely devoted to serving the common good. Together, they worked on legal reforms, foreign policy initiatives, and cultural projects that seemed to promise a golden age for England. Thomas quickly became one of Henry's most trusted advisors, helping to negotiate treaties, draft legislation, and handle the delicate diplomatic relationships that determined England's place in European politics. His combination of legal expertise and moral integrity made him invaluable to a king who wanted to be seen as both powerful and just. In 1529, Henry appointed Thomas as Lord Chancellor of England, the highest judicial office in the kingdom and the second most powerful position in the government. It was an unprecedented honor for someone who was not a member of the nobility or the high clergy, a recognition of Thomas's extraordinary abilities and the king's complete confidence in his judgment. But there was one issue on which Thomas and Henry had never fully agreed. One question that had the potential to destroy their partnership and everything Thomas had built. Henry was growing increasingly frustrated with his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce the male heir he desperately needed to secure his dynasty. The storm that would test Thomas's integrity to its breaking point was about to break. By 1527, King Henry VIII had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid in the eyes of God. Catherine had been briefly married to Henry's deceased brother Arthur, and Henry now claimed that this previous marriage made their union sinful and explained why they had no surviving male children. What Henry called the king's great matter was actually a complex web of theology, law, politics, and personal desire. Henry genuinely believed he needed a male heir to prevent civil war after his death, but he was also passionately infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a young court lady who refused to become his mistress and demanded marriage. The legal and theological arguments were intricate. Canon law contained provisions that could be interpreted to support either side of the question. Some scholars argued that the original papal dispensation, allowing Henry to marry his brother's widow, had been invalid. Others maintained that the marriage was perfectly legitimate and that Henry's desire for annulment was simply royal lust disguised as theological concern. Thomas More found himself in an impossible position. As Lord Chancellor, he was expected to support the king's policies without question. As a lawyer, he was trained to analyze evidence objectively and reach conclusions based on legal principles rather than political convenience. As a Catholic, he was bound by his understanding of church teaching on the indissolubility of marriage. After careful study of the theological and legal arguments, Thomas concluded that Henry's marriage to Catherine was valid and that the king had no grounds for seeking an annulment. This put him in direct opposition to Henry's most passionate desire and created a conflict that would ultimately prove irreconcilable. Initially, Henry seemed willing to accept Thomas's disagreement on this issue as long as he remained silent and didn't actively oppose the king's efforts to obtain an annulment from Rome. Thomas was relieved to avoid a direct confrontation and threw himself into his other duties as Lord Chancellor with renewed energy. But the situation became increasingly untenable as Henry's frustration with papal delays grew into open defiance of Roman authority. When Pope Clement VII refused to grant the annulment, Henry began to question not just this particular papal decision, but the entire authority of Rome over the English Church. Thomas watched with growing alarm as Henry moved toward a complete break with the Catholic Church. The king was not just seeking to end his marriage, he was preparing to declare himself the supreme head of the Church in England, with authority to grant his own annulment and remake English Christianity according to his own desires. For Thomas, this crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He could accept disagreement on specific legal questions, but he could not accept the fundamental rejection of papal authority that Henry was contemplating. The conflict between conscience and loyalty was about to become unavoidable. In May 1532, faced with Henry's demand that all English clergy acknowledge him as supreme head of the Church of England, Thomas More resigned as Lord Chancellor. It was a decision that shocked the English court and marked the beginning of his final confrontation with royal power. The man who had everything was about to discover what he valued more than life itself. Thomas More's resignation as Lord Chancellor sent shockwaves through English society. Here was the king's most trusted advisor, the second most powerful man in the kingdom, voluntarily giving up wealth, influence, and prestige rather than compromise his conscience. The message was unmistakable. Even Henry's closest allies had limits to their loyalty. Henry was furious, but also confused. He had offered Thomas everything a man could want: power, wealth, royal favor, a chance to shape the destiny of nations. Why would anyone throw all of that away over what the king saw as minor theological technicalities? Thomas retreated to his beloved home in Chelsea, hoping to live quietly as a private citizen while the storm of religious and political controversy raged around him. He stopped his generous entertaining, dismissed most of his servants, and even sold his chain of office to pay his debts. The man who had once dined with ambassadors and kings now lived simply with his family, finding joy in books, prayer, and the company of those he loved most. But silence proved impossible to maintain. In 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony, and Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, declared the king's marriage to Catherine invalid. Parliament passed the Act of Succession, which required all subjects to swear an oath recognizing the validity of Henry's new marriage and the legitimacy of any children born to Anne Boleyn. Thomas was summoned to swear the oath, along with other prominent citizens. His refusal was quiet but absolute. He would not take an oath that implicitly rejected papal authority and validated what he believed to be an invalid marriage. He was willing to remain silent about the king's actions, but he would not actively endorse what his conscience told him was wrong. "I cannot swear to the contents of this oath without imperiling my soul," Thomas told the royal commissioners. "I will neither blame nor condemn any man for swearing, for every man must follow his own conscience, but my conscience will not permit me to swear." The refusal to take the oath was legally considered treason, punishable by death. Thomas was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where he had once served as a trusted royal advisor. The irony was not lost on him. The king who had elevated him to the highest offices in the land was now prepared to execute him for following the very principles of integrity that had made him valuable in the first place. In the Tower, Thomas spent his days writing, praying, and corresponding with his family. His letters from prison reveal a man at peace with his decision, sad about the pain he was causing his loved ones, but unshakable in his conviction that he had chosen correctly. "I find no cause to reckon myself in worse case here than at home," he wrote to his daughter Meg, "for methinketh God maketh me a wanton, and setteth me on his lap and dandleth me." How do you choose between loyalty to earthly authority and fidelity to eternal truth? For over a year, Thomas More remained imprisoned in the Tower of London, while Henry hoped that harsh conditions and pressure from family and friends would break his resolve. The king desperately wanted Thomas's approval for his actions. The support of England's most respected lawyer and scholar would have provided enormous legitimacy for Henry's break with Rome. For over a year, Thomas More remained imprisoned in the Tower of London, while Henry hoped that harsh conditions and pressure from family and friends would break his resolve. The king desperately wanted Thomas's approval for his actions. The support of England's most respected lawyer and scholar would have provided enormous legitimacy for Henry's break with Rome. The pressure on Thomas was enormous. His beloved wife Alice visited him regularly, begging him to take the oath and return to his family. "What will you gain by this obstinacy?" she asked through tears. "You will lose everything. Your life, your property, your family's security. And for what? For the Pope in Rome who doesn't even know your name?" Thomas's response revealed the depth of his convictions. "Alice, I may lose my life, but I cannot lose my soul. The opinion of one man, even if he be a king, cannot change what is true or false, right or wrong." His children also pleaded with him to compromise. They argued that his death would serve no useful purpose, that he could do more good alive than dead, that surely God would understand if he took the oath while maintaining private reservations. But Thomas understood something that his family, in their love and desperation, could not see. Some principles are so fundamental that compromising them destroys the very foundation of moral life. If conscience could be bought with threats or sold for comfort, then conscience would cease to exist as a meaningful guide for human action. In July 1535, Thomas was finally brought to trial on charges of high treason. The proceeding was a foregone conclusion. The verdict had been determined before the trial began. But Thomas used the occasion to deliver one of the most eloquent defenses of conscience and religious freedom in legal history. "I have not been a man of such holy living as I might be bold to offer myself to death," he said, "but I thank our Lord, I am resolved to die in this matter. Therefore, my Lord, this is all I have to say. I die the king's good servant, but God's first." The words summarize perfectly the principle for which Thomas was willing to die. He bore no personal animosity toward Henry, felt no hatred for those who had condemned him, and maintained his loyalty to England and its people. But when human authority conflicted with divine authority, there could be no question about which must take precedence. The court pronounced the inevitable sentence of death, and Thomas was led back to the Tower to await execution. But his trial had accomplished something that no amount of royal propaganda could achieve. It had demonstrated to all of Europe that Henry's religious revolution was opposed by the very best of English minds and hearts. On the 6th of July, 1535, Thomas More walked to his execution on Tower Hill with the same calm dignity that had marked his entire public career. He had spent his final weeks in prayer, writing, and correspondence with his family, preparing his soul for the meeting with God that he had chosen over continued life on earth. The crowd that gathered to witness his execution was massive and largely sympathetic. Thomas had been beloved by the common people of London, who saw in him a rare example of a powerful man who genuinely cared about justice and the welfare of ordinary citizens. His willingness to die rather than compromise his beliefs only increased their admiration for his character. As Thomas mounted the scaffold, he remained true to his promise not to condemn the king publicly. His final speech was brief and diplomatic. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first. I call upon you all to witness that I die in and for the faith of the Holy Catholic Church." When the executioner asked for his forgiveness, as was customary, Thomas embraced him and said, "Courage, my good man. Remember that you but send me to God." Even in his final moments, Thomas displayed the wit and humanity that had endeared him to so many. When he knelt to place his head on the block, he carefully moved his beard aside, remarking to the executioner that it had committed no treason and deserved no punishment. The axe fell, and Thomas More's earthly life ended. But his witness to the supremacy of conscience over coercion, truth over convenience, and God over earthly authority had just begun to transform the world. News of Thomas's execution spread rapidly throughout Europe, causing shock and condemnation even among those who had supported Henry's break with Rome. Here was a man universally recognized for his learning, integrity, and loyalty, who had been executed simply for following his conscience. The brutality of his death undermined Henry's claims to be acting in defense of justice and truth. Pope Paul III declared Thomas a martyr almost immediately, and the process of recognizing his sanctity began within decades of his death. But Thomas's influence extended far beyond the Catholic Church. His defense of conscience against state coercion became a foundational principle of religious freedom and human rights that would inspire reformers and revolutionaries for centuries to come. The lawyer who had chosen God over a king had proven that some loyalties transcend all earthly powers, that some truths are worth dying for, and that conscience, properly formed and courageously followed, is the most powerful force in human affairs. 400 years after his execution, on the 19th of May 1935, Pope Pius XI canonized Thomas More as a saint of the Catholic Church. But the recognition of his extraordinary witness extended far beyond any single religious tradition. Thomas had become a universal symbol of conscience, triumphing over coercion, integrity, defeating expediency, and moral courage overcoming political pressure. In 2000, Pope John Paul II declared St. Thomas More the patron saint of statesmen and politicians, recognizing his unique witness to the possibility of combining public service with uncompromising moral integrity. The declaration was remarkable. Here was the Church holding up as a model, not a hermit or mystic, but a married man, a successful lawyer, and a political leader who had found holiness in the very heart of worldly affairs. Thomas's utopia continued to influence political thought throughout the centuries, inspiring everyone from social reformers to revolutionary leaders who found in his vision of an ideal society a critique of existing injustices and a blueprint for human flourishing based on reason and virtue. His legal writings helped establish fundamental principles of jurisprudence that remain influential today. The importance of due process, the rights of the accused, the obligation of judges to seek truth rather than merely follow power, and the supremacy of natural law over positive law when the two conflict. Perhaps most importantly, Thomas More's life and death established a precedent for civil disobedience that would inspire countless movements for justice and freedom. From the American colonists who resisted unjust British laws to the civil rights activists who challenged segregation, from the opponents of totalitarian regimes to the defenders of human rights worldwide, Thomas's example showed that there are times when loyalty to higher law requires resistance to earthly authority. Modern lawyers, judges, and politicians continue to study Thomas More's career as an example of how to maintain integrity in public life. His willingness to sacrifice career advancement, financial security, and even life itself, rather than violate his conscience, provides a powerful alternative to the cynicism and compromise that often characterize contemporary politics. Universities around the world have established chairs and programs in his honor, recognizing him as a model of the engaged intellectual who brings scholarly learning to bear on practical problems, while maintaining unwavering commitment to truth and justice. But perhaps Thomas's most important legacy is the challenge he poses to every person facing pressure to compromise their deepest convictions. In boardrooms and courtrooms, in political offices and family discussions, in situations large and small, his witness asks the same fundamental question: what principles are you willing to suffer for? What truths are worth more than comfort, security, or even life itself? St. Thomas More, the lawyer who chose God over a king, reminds us that conscience is not a luxury for those who can afford it, but a necessity for anyone who wants to remain fully human. His legacy challenges us to ask, when your deepest convictions conflict with external pressure, which will you choose? And are you prepared to pay the price that integrity sometimes demands? Thomas discovered that some things really are non-negotiable, not because they are profitable or convenient, but because they are true. His witness across the centuries continues to proclaim that truth is worth any sacrifice, that conscience cannot be bought or sold, and that the soul is more precious than all the kingdoms of the earth.